Hello, my name is Dr. Marcy Littlefield, and today I'm going to discuss the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was a severe form of discrimination in American society. Most of these images were taken from the New York Historical Society's exhibit on the Chinese Exclusion Act. And as you can see in this photo, the Chinese Exclusion Act happened in 1882, but a number of these ads showed up in newspapers to actually garner support, to exclude the Chinese and to discriminate against the Chinese. So you can see, looking at the ads here, the first one, Hip Hip Hooray, the Chinese excluded. These are things that came out after the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed. You can see this image up here, the Chinese must go. And here is just another form of the way in which the Chinese were seen in a derogatory way, and a number of stereotypes surrounded them. You can see here cheap labor, immorality, the opium trade, just all of these things help to Congress to pass an act which exclude the Chinese. Here's another ad that showed up, the exclusion fence. Again, the Chinese are targeted. Here again, these are a lot of the ads that showed up to garner support among Americans when the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed. And if you can see here in this ad, this is showing a black person, a freedman from bulldoze the United States, go west, go east. This is supposed to be a Chinese, Chinese, and this ad is showing difficult problem solving itself. And this is what was happening. The late 1800s, the Chinese and African Americans were experiencing a number of issues as it related to how America was dealing with the newly found freedmen for Black Americans and the number of Chinese immigrants that were migrating to the United States. So as America industrialized in the 1870s, intense social conflict divided racial groups and economic classes. And what that means is that they were really trying to find blame, to blame someone for a number of the problems that the United States found themselves in. A number of fear and envy of the Chinese because they were industrious started in the West, and it quickly spread nationally. And political parties used the Chinese question in order to win support. Now, these images were taken, and this is how up until the Chinese Exclusion Act, these are some of the things that were going on in order to garner support to say, yes, the Chinese are not like everyone else. You can see here, this is a picture. This is talking about facial angles. So it's trying again to create this racial hierarchy to say that the Chinese are not like everyone else. This Popular Science magazine article used facial angles to prove the existence of a racial hierarchy. And this happened with the Chinese. We know that it also happened with Black Americans, but it also happened with the Chinese. And it's important to really understand how Asian Americans were also discriminated against in this country and used to say, also put in this whole racial hierarchy that categorized people by race. When submitted to Congress, the testimony warned, these hardy Mongolians with their particular civilization have met us at the Golden Gate and have begun the contest for ascendancy. This was one of the many attempts to demonstrate a scientific basis for white supremacy. Again, these racial stereotypes continue to plague our society as I do now. All these things led up to the Chinese Exclusion Act. This was another one. These were racial stereotypes which tried to talk about why Chinese Americans would not assimilate. These pictures were meant to say, see, they're not like us. They're not deserving of the same privileges. There was a number of anti-Chinese violence. Some of you saw this happening again as the coronavirus plagued our society from 2020 to even now. But in it looks like the same thing is happening again. But in the 1880s, there was a lot of Chinese violence, and across the American West and the Midwest, cold-blooded beatings and murders and arson of Chinese-owned property and riots and mass explosions in cities like Denver, in California, and Seattle unleashed years of terror on Chinese Americans. So this was just really describing all these things that led up to the Chinese Exclusion Act. There were a few victories like this one. However, by 1902, the Congress reenacted the Chinese exclusion in 1902, this time with no expiration date. And this is when it became part of law. If you see here, this document on the side really just documents some of the propaganda that went out to convince people and to convince Congress that really the Chinese don't deserve rights. This ad says some reasons for Chinese exclusion: meat versus rice, American manhood versus Asiatic coolieism, which shall survive. So this is a picture of some of the pamphlets that went around, because people were really upset about Chinese labor. And the act excluded Chinese laborers from entering the U.S., but it exempted students, teachers, merchants, and diplomats. And Roosevelt was really eager to put forth this act. Over 300 Chinamen were arrested in a big roundup by the police, as you can see from this article. And laborers were excluded. And so these are some of the pictures of the laborers, real laborers that were excluded during this time period. This labor was not allowed to enter after 1882, when the act was passed. And again, what's interesting about this is that while laborers were not allowed to enter because laborers directly were in competition with American workers, diplomats were allowed to enter. So this diplomat was allowed to enter with his family members after 1882 because he had proof of identity. And so students were also allowed to enter, but women weren't allowed to enter after 1882 because they were restricted because they were seen as possible prostitutes. So this compromise, allowing students, teachers, merchants, and diplomats to enter while not allowing laborers and others who were migrating, resolved a number of political issues between those interested in trade with China and those interested in banning Chinese laborers. So these are actual pictures, again, from the exhibit, which just really discuss, these are actual pictures that they had to actually prove their identity and prove who they were. And this was also the time period during the eugenics movement when America was really taking hold to eugenics ideals that some groups are a burden to society while others are not. And this whole idea that heredity makes a difference in education and what you're able to do and what your life looks like. And again, these are just different ads that were put out to say that those from Asian descent should not be naturalized. Naturalized is a term to say, can you be America? So they were restricted. They were restricted from being able to being able to migrate here to society. And the problem with the Chinese Exclusion Act is that it was the first time in United States history that it explicitly restricted immigration based on race and class. And this is why it was so detrimental. Despite a great deal of challenges, President Roosevelt made it permanent in 1902, and it was enacted into law. And it stayed into effect until 1943. This was really problematic for these communities because, as you can see here, this is a picture of a family, but they're all men because women weren't allowed to migrate. So so there were a number of legal barriers between 1875 and 1882 that kept out Chinese women. And as you can see, families suffered as a result of that. And this is one example. This is a picture of a family. As you can see, some of the women are actually taken out and put into the picture. This was a way to still for families to still have their whole family in some of the shots, even though they weren't allowed to be together. Thank you.